Welcome, everyone, to Diamond's webinar series. Today, we'll be joined by Sherry Brunhaber of VMware and Chris O'Brien with OLG, and moderated by Joe Devon of Diamond. A little bit about our webinar series. We host these monthly. I'm super excited as this year we launched our first Accessibility in the Enterprise blog, which features leaders from various companies sharing their insights on how their companies approach accessibility. Sherry and Chris will be joining Joe today to really discuss how VMware and OLG are tackling some of the issues and some of the progress they've been making as well in their roles. So please welcome Joe Devon. He's the co-founder of Diamond. We are a digital agency that builds accessible experience. He's also the co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day and the chair of the GAD Foundation.
Thank you, Natasha. Welcome everyone to our webinar on accessibility in the enterprise. I have to warn you that we have an all-Canadian panel, including myself, so I cannot guarantee that hockey commentary will not break out. Now, note that we'll have time for Q&A.
Go Maple Leafs.
Note that we will have time for Q&A at the end, but please do ask your questions throughout by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom over here. So first, let me invite the panelists to turn on your video and unmute yourselves. Welcome, Chris.
Hello.
And welcome, Sherry. And I'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'll go first, if you don't mind.
Oh, go ahead. Who's on the province most to the east?
Oh, you. Well, then it's you, then Sherry. After you.
I'm kidding. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. I'm Chris O'Brien, and I'm the director of accessibility for OLG. OLG is the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation, and so as the name implies, we handle all lottery and gaming for the province of Ontario. And what's kind of unique about what we do is the proceeds of profits that we gather during the course of a year all go back to the provincial government, and they use those proceeds for building infrastructure and so on and so forth. So.
That's great. Thanks. Sherry?
So I'm Sherry Brunhaber. I founded the VMware Accessibility Program and the Disability at VMware Employee Resource Group. I'm currently an accessibility architect, which means I focus on corporate-wide initiatives, working with various different committees on new accessibility standards, strategy, and innovation and outreach with VMware's many, many suppliers.
Thanks, Sherry. And you also are very prolific on social media and Medium, writing lots of great blog posts on accessibility. So I'm going to add that.
Thank you for that.
Of course. So before we begin, I'd like to just say we can make this very conversational because we have some great expertise over here, and I'm sure we can have great conversation without the need for like a straight up Q&A, though I do have lots of questions prepared. So to that end, why don't we start with something very important about anybody that wants to start their own accessibility journey in the enterprise, which is the ratio of how many folks are in the accessibility department versus how many people they're supporting. So would you be able to share what the size is of your accessibility team and how many folks you support? And anybody can start.
So VMware has about 20 accessibility subject matter experts right now, of which somewhere between probably 50% and 60% have a disability and are native users of assistive technology, which is something that I think is really important. And I talk about every opportunity that I can get. We support about 11,000 developers, I believe. So obviously, programs that talk about accessibility outside of the accessibility team are very important to our success. Right.
So clearly there's a big challenge over there. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I have, including myself, there's 4 of us, and we support an organization of approximately 1,300 people. And because my group supports the AODA requirements, we have to also take care of things outside of digital too. So it can be quite challenging for sure. But I feel like this is an issue that we all sort of face.
Yeah, absolutely. So how, with a small team, what would you say is the methodology for supporting such a large organization? How do you get like what challenges do you have, and how do you overcome them in terms of that scale? Chris, why don't you go first?
Sure. For myself, awareness is always an issue, right? People often don't have touch points with people with disabilities. They don't understand the issues. So it's keeping that top of mind, getting them to recognize that my group needs to be included in initiatives from the onset. So a lot of it has to do with, proper communication, putting yourself out there, and training is a big part of what we try to do, and just kind of raising the competencies of the organization as a whole. You're never striving for perfection, but every time you have a meaningful discussion with somebody, hopefully they take something away from that conversation, and then that little nugget makes its way into the workflow, and you make iterative progress that way.
Any thoughts on that, Sherry, and anything you'd add from your side?
Yeah, so if you look at the standard capability maturity model measurements for software development, where 1 is you're not doing anything and 5 is everybody wants to copy you, you're at about a level 3, which is a mid-level, when you've got a hub and spoke model. So the developers and the rest of the organization are at the ends of the spokes, and they're pulling information directly from you. When you get to a level 5, it means that everybody's got some level of knowledge about accessibility, and they know when they get in over their heads, then they can reach out to the hub for information. So we think that it's important to understand that accessibility is a journey. You got to start somewhere, and starting somewhere is, building that hub. But also self-service is really important, especially when you're in a global organization, because if somebody in India needs an answer at 2 o'clock in the morning, you want to make that answer easy for them to find and not have to wait an entire business cycle to get it.
Absolutely. And you really have an interesting challenge in that you've got a set of internal users, usually external users as well, and you've got to balance all of that, and you really need to get buy-in from the top and from the bottom. What are some good techniques to get there, and what is most difficult in your case? Is it to get buy-in from the top or from bottom up? Sherry?
I would say we've really been lucky in that we've been able to leverage our employee resource group to get a lot of great things accomplished, like overhauling our reasonable accommodations program, having closed captioning available on all our corporate-wide events. So that's been something that's useful. Many large companies have silos, and when you're trying to spend money across that benefits the entire company, that can get complicated. And so that's where we leverage our executive support to try to provide support and financing for our larger, more expensive initiatives.
Makes sense. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I've approached it from many different ways, trying to work with individual groups, also, making presentations to the senior executive levels. And my approach was to try to, describe accessibility as, a business differentiator, where you're trying to capture that part of the market segment that you would be leaving behind if you're not taking advantage of, creating features and functionality that are accessible to everybody. So that's really the approach that I've taken. We're very much a corporate culture in that sense. So you want to, when you're trying to make a pitch to somebody, you want to speak in their language, and to describe accessibility as a business practice as opposed to like a corporate social responsibility is sometimes a much easier way to approach it.
Yeah,
and
so
I've had some
really,
pretty good success so far.
yeah, so it's really about the business case of accessibility.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because I don't know, over the years, I'd say when I first got involved in this industry, there's a lot of frustration. And then every time you'd hear a talk on the business case for accessibility, sometimes it felt like an attempt to make the case stronger than it was, when in fact it's super strong. There's no need for like trying to overstate it. It's just so obvious. 11% of our lives will have some kind of disability, and it's all on a spectrum. And the know-how of accessibility just makes your product better up and down the line. It doesn't matter if you're doing software, hardware, or anything else. So the case sort of makes itself, as long as we don't try to be too, I don't know what the word is, prescriptive or excuse me, try to kind of sell it, if that makes sense. Has that been your experience too?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing for me is, and obviously we're all very much proponents of accessibility, but I think we all realize to a certain degree, it's very achievable as long as accessibility is scoped in the right spot. So if you can get in from the beginning, it's actually not that hard to make your stuff work the way it needs to work. It's only when it's left to the end, and I know like this is just a common trope that we always deal with, but I mean it's so true. It's that piece. So it's making that argument and then getting people to appreciate that accessibility is not just one thing. It's not a monolith. You don't just do it at one spot. It's supposed to be embedded throughout your SDLC or your process.
Sherry?
Yeah, so I take a more civil rights perspective, to go back a second to Chris's earlier answer, and maybe that's because I'm an attorney and I did spend 8 years as an advocate for the deaf in the legal system. But Chris is absolutely right in that you've got several arguments to choose from, and you should choose the one that works best for the audience that you're currently speaking to. If you're talking to product owners, you want to talk about sales. If you're talking to HR, you want to talk about the ability to recruit millennials and have high levels of job satisfaction for your employees with disabilities. I try not to focus too much on the business case because, as you mentioned, Joe, I really don't honestly feel that one is necessary. And if somebody's asking for a business case, really what they're doing is they're asking for a delay because they know it's going to take you time to build the business case. And so that's not my favorite approach. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I don't do it, just means I don't like doing it.
Yeah, and I don't know if I even worded it right, but just every time I run into the business case, it just seems kind of bizarre and funny to me when it's just so obvious what the business case is. There's just so many people that have disabilities, and every one of us is just a matter of when and what our disability is going to be. So anyway.
Yeah, and so to talk about the second part of Chris's answer, where we talk about end or beginning, that's another kind of question, because you want to do it as soon as you can in your ideation or design process. So I'm going to get this backwards because I have trouble with my left and right when I'm looking at myself on a video. But I started off actually in software testing. I did that for about 10 years before I started to be an advocate for the deaf. And in general, run-of-the-mill software testing, we have a principle called shift left. And shift left means the earlier you find the bug, or even better, if you prevent the bug from ever occurring, the cheaper it's going to be for you down the road. So we talk about the power of 10x, that every level, alpha release, if it costs you $1 to fix and design, it'll cost you $10 to fix an alpha. It'll cost you $100 to fix in beta. It'll cost you $1,000 to fix if it's in production. Accessibility at that abstract level is no different than any other type of software testing. It still has the power of 10 at every level. And if you can prevent the bugs from happening, every dollar you spend on that, you're going to save $1,000 in production emergency patches down the road.
That's very well said.
And that's kind of why I feel the business case. I know it's not ideal, but a lot of people wouldn't know that, right? That's a very specific piece of knowledge that if you're not in software or development, you wouldn't know that. So that's an important thing to communicate to stakeholders, so that if your executives know, like, wow, if we're not capturing these defects early enough, we're actually slowing ourselves down, and we're not being quote unquote agile. So I think it's really good to communicate those types of things as well to management, so they can have that message cascade down to the rest of the team.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's get to something a little more specific. Are there any challenges that are unique to your organization or your industry, Chris?
Um, I mean, a little bit. We used to be a much larger organization in that we have casinos and we have racetracks and whatnot, and they all used to be OLG people. But we changed our business model a few years back, and we started relying on a service provider model, whereby or other organizations would own and operate those establishments. Now they're operating under our brand. So the interesting thing for us was trying to establish, when it comes to something like AODA, where does the responsibility lie? Is it our responsibility, or is it their responsibility? So that was something that it took a while to work out, and it was kind of unique to us, just based on that operating model that we have.
Okay. And how about you? Any unique challenges and unique solutions?
For sure. So the pandemic has definitely escalated the migration to SaaS. And, think about how we used to release software in, quote unquote, the old days. So pre-pandemic, because old is 2 years in tech. You would have a major release with lots of features once a year, maybe twice a year if it was a newer product. And then you would have a couple of minor releases during the year that might have, process improvements or, less critical bug fixes. Now under SaaS, people are releasing sometimes upwards of a couple hundred times a week. Even apps get updated sometimes multiple times per week. And with the 30-70 split between automated accessibility testing and manual, with 30% being what you can do in an automated manner and 70% being what you have to do manually, it becomes impossible to re-execute all of your manual tests every time you do a release. And so that means getting accessibility baked into your processes is even more important, because you're relying on the developers not to write buggy code. And that's something that's critical for SaaS. And then the other thing, which VMware has taken quite seriously, is the ability to get that 30% number higher. So we are currently working on a project that involves machine learning. And if you go to VMware's GitHub repository, it's a product called Crest. It is currently in the open source. So as a proof of concept, we took 5 things that had to be tested pretty much on a manual basis previously, and we developed machine learning models to test them instead, and it was very successful. And we have 16 more success criteria that we plan on doing in the next year, and we think at the end of that we'll be at about a 50-50 split, which would be still difficult, but much better than 30-70.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. And what kind of, from the other 16, what do you feel are more achievable? Like what kind of things lend themselves to that machine learning approach?
Sure. So one of the things that drives screen reader users crazy is when you have a button, a function, and you select that function and other things change that you aren't informed of. So we're looking at a method of actually identifying those changes and making sure that the right code has been implemented to announce all those changes to screen reader users. That's a very time-intensive manual thing to test right now, and we think we have a pretty good idea of how to tackle it in an automated manner.
Great. Carolyn Chesler asks, where can I learn more about the machine learning automation? I assume vmware.github.com?
It's, hang on a sec, I'll read out the URL because it's pretty short. It is github.com/VMware, so the letters V and M for virtual machine, WARE/crest. And it is an open source project. We have a governance council. We're talking right now with W3C about the possibility of getting it integrated with some W3C initiatives. I also have a requisition open right now. So if anybody knows anybody who's looking for a machine learning job, please send them to me.
Great. What was I going to say? Oh, and then Bob Lichtenfeld says case sensitivity after the slash? Question mark.
Don't think so. Hang on a sec. You would think I would have this memorized by now. No, all lowercase.
All lowercase. Okay, thank you. And now I remember what I was going to say. I saw a hand up from David, and there's a hand up, a raise hand button, which I'm not even sure what it does, but you have to click on Q&A in order to actually ask a question. All right.
So somebody asked in the chat how to get them to me. The best way is to have them connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Byrne-Haber on LinkedIn. You don't have to worry about mixing me up with somebody else.
Thank you, and good catch. How about making sure that when you do procurement of apps, websites, software, how do you make sure that nobody in the organization purchases something that is inaccessible?
Well, I'd love to tackle that because that's something that VMware spent a lot of time on over the last year. So in April, we published an internal accessibility policy. And so that internal accessibility policy uses our accommodations requests as a repository. And because keep in mind, we're implementing this midstream. It's much, much easier to do it if you implement it before you buy the first thing. But of course, that rarely happens. Usually what happens is you have a pool of inaccessible stuff, then you get a complaint, and then you go, well, I can stop the bleeding going forward, saying, I'm not going to buy any more inaccessible software. How do I fix all the stuff that's already in place? So we did stop the bleeding. Procurement has undergone specific training at VMware to ask for VPADs if they're not sure about something that's sent to them. The accessibility team gets involved to provide feedback on whether or not something's accessible enough. We work with all of our vendors to help them improve their accessibility with the ultimate goal of improving accessibility for everybody, not just improving, when Slack releases an accessibility fix, it's because VMware asked for it. It's not for VMware, it's for everybody. So that's a really important thing to understand. So our 3 pillars for this policy are buy, use, build. Okay, because it's not enough to prevent procurement from buying stuff that's inaccessible. Usually you're also building stuff internally, and you may be using stuff for the open source. And so the open source in particular is somewhere else it's really important to contribute back accessibility changes. Bootstrap today would not be accessible if PayPal hadn't contributed all their accessibility rewrites back, which was, I think, about 7 years ago now at this point. But that's really critical because open source efforts frequently don't have the wherewithal or the resources to make things accessible. So if you like something enough to fix it, send it back so that everybody can benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you find that working with vendors, since you brought up vendors and VPATs, do you find that they're receptive when they're told about their accessibility issues?
Depends on the vendor. So I'm not going to name names. Startups seem to be more amenable to fixing things because they're set up to move in a more agile manner. Speed and breaking things is something that they're familiar with. Larger companies tend to sometimes react like that they know everything and you shouldn't be telling them how to do stuff. Those are generalizations, and like I said, I'm not going to name names, but we're working with 41 vendors right now. We picked the top 41 of our kind of 285 inaccessible tools, and the vast majority of them are being quite collaborative.
That's good. about you, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, this is a nut that I'm in the process of cracking right now. Just trying to get procurement to understand what the expectations are and what the downstream impacts of procuring inaccessible things are to the organization. We're, as an organization, undergoing a whole change of mindset. We're trying to go more agile. Like for everyone to understand, we are a typical kind of government organization, so things tend to be a little slower. But we now have a new executive CEO who's very much from the banking organization, wants to go speed to market. We have a lot of products that we're trying to push. So the whole notion of agility is being pushed on us, which is great. However, you need all aspects of the business to be agile in order for that to work properly. So what I'm doing now is trying to, once again, and this is very much a business case thing where you're trying to explain to all the stakeholders, listen, if we don't get this right now, this is going to cost us down the road. So trying to get them to use VPADs in as much as possible. We'll provide evaluations on the responses and add it as a score. So it's not going to be the decision point, but at least it's part of the decision. And I feel like over time that will slowly start to improve. And one of the things is a lot of people think that accessibility is only for public facing, but as we all know, everyone has a right to accessible software tooling and whatnot. And Sherry brought up the accommodations aspect of it, and that's spot on. So we're just trying to work to have the organization understand that accessibility is for everybody, and it's everyone's responsibility to take part in that.
Absolutely.
Although I will remind our listeners that in a perfect world, if you're providing perfect accessibility, and there's honestly probably no such thing, you should never ever receive an accommodations request. Okay, accommodations requests mean that something got messed up somewhere along the way. It means somebody is saying, this isn't accessible to me, I can't use this with my assistive technology, and I need you, which is usually whoever in HR handles the accommodations requests, to figure out a workaround. When you only buy inclusive products, you shouldn't be getting that many. It should reduce the number of accommodations requests you get.
Definitely should. By the way, Sherry, Vicky says she doesn't do LinkedIn. So.
Okay, so my direct email is sbernhaber, no hyphen, BYRNEHABER @VMware.com.
Thank you. We're going to be going to questions soon, so we don't have enough questions. So I'd like to invite the audience to add into the questions, by the way. Chris, can you please define the AODA or explain what it is for folks in the audience who don't know?
So it's provincial legislation, accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So it's similar to ADA in the sense that unfortunately governments have had to step in and prescribe requirements for businesses to ensure basic human rights for people with disabilities. And so it's legislation that we follow to ensure those rights. And it's there's 5 different standards, spanning from information communication through built space. So I mean, we can have a discussion about that altogether, about the effectiveness of the legislation, but generally, that's the purpose of it. And it's helpful to a certain degree, but I think I wish it was a lot more prescriptive than it is, to be quite honest with you.
The nice thing about AODA is it requires updates every year, and it requires proactive disclosure by the organization that comes under the legislation. In contrast, in the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act is entirely either complaint or litigious driven. You have 2 options. You can either file a complaint with the Department of Justice, or you can file a lawsuit. There's nothing else. There's no ADA inspectors. There's no it's very much at the end of the process. You have to have been actively discriminated against in order to then go back and try to get anything done. It's not like that you're trying to prevent the discrimination from happening in the first place. So I'll give you an example. My it's about 9 years ago, I think now, my youngest child's junior high school graduation was inaccessible. They had it on this really horrible potholey football field, and I ended up having to watch it from like 200 yards away on the sidewalk because I couldn't get my wheelchair through to any of the seats. Okay, that bell's already rung. That discrimination has already happened. Having to file a complaint afterwards doesn't reinstate me with getting to experience my daughter's junior high school graduation. Whereas AOTA asks these questions up front. Are the services you're providing accessible? Is the support that you're providing accessible? So I think that AOTA takes a much more shift left methodology, which I like, than the ADA. But I think neither are perfect.
Yeah, and what we've been waiting on for a long time on the ADA side of things is to have the FTC provide guidance and state that that the ADA applies to digital accessibility and that WCAG is the standard that would apply to it. That would be a tremendous help because then you already know the result of all of the legal action. The Ninth Circuit has been ruling in favor of accessibility plaintiffs, but it would just make things so much easier if that was clarified more specifically. So
yeah, but the Fifth Circuit hasn't, and I think eventually it's going to have to go up to the Supreme Court, and then I hope that the Supreme Court doesn't punt like they did on the Domino's case, where they just kicked it back down to a lower court on a technicality.
Yes, yeah, true. What are your thoughts, or do you use accessibility champions, by the way, or some other version thereof? What are your thoughts on the whole concept of accessibility champions? Because I've heard some great things, and I've heard some folks that weren't that happy with it.
Yeah, so we do have an accessibility champions program at VMware. It was probably the third thing that we established when we were starting the program 3 years ago, where the first before that obviously was training. Training is always the first thing that you want to do when you're starting an accessibility program. I think it's good for getting the word out and having the word accessibility being spoken in the room when the accessibility team isn't there. I think that's also a reason why it is so critical to have all your recruiting and onboarding and retention processes 100% accessible, because when you have a psychologically safe space and you have a high percentage of employees with disability, and when I say high percentage, I mean like 5% is considered high for a self-disclosure rate. They're going to talk about accessibility, even when the accessibility champions aren't in the room, because it's something that resonates with them or somebody that they know who has a disability. So we have 3 tiers, basic, we've identified what people have to do to qualify for each tier. My one concern is that people who finish, at the highest tier sometimes think that they're accessibility experts, but the problem is they're not certified, and accessibility does change. Assistive technology changes, approach changes, plugins change. It's a rapidly evolving career, and it's one that if you don't keep up on those things, your information gets rapidly stale.
Yeah, that's very true. How about you, Chris? Do you use accessibility champions?
So we have something at OLG called regulatory lead. So it's not a dedicated champions network, as it were, but it's similar to Champions Network in the sense that you have a bunch of people that are, as subject matter experts, we provide information into this group, and then as they're doing their day-to-day and engaging with other parts of the organization, if they sense that there's issues, or they'll potentially bring stuff to us. Just, they're not passing along information per se, but it's more just expanding your eyes and ears, as it were, so you can become aware of things that you may not have been aware on, or looped in on things that you may not have been looped in on. So from that perspective, it's somewhat effective. I'm curious to ask Sherry about our ERG group. Would you consider that actually an effective champions group of sorts?
Well, at VMware, definitely it has been. We've been able to leverage, for example, our neurodiversity hiring initiative through the Champions program. I would say the data point I would add about both champions programs and ERGs is don't rely on volunteers. Okay, because we create a situation sometimes where there's inherent conflict between the person who wants to volunteer and their boss, where if they're spending time on this other thing, maybe they get credit for it in terms of their career growth, maybe they don't. Some companies actually pay ERG groups and accessibility champions, most don't. So think about, how are you going to compensate? Air quotes around compensate, because compensate doesn't always mean money. Sometimes it means credit. Sometimes it means, like I said, a leg up on, some kind of special training program that you can get into, or something that you can do that will inherently keep that valuable employee with your company. If you 100% rely on volunteers, that in the long term usually has issues. Mm-hmm.
Great point. Just for those who don't know, can you explain what ERG is?
Yes. So ERG is Employee Resource Group. Sometimes they're referred to as BRGs, which is Business Resource Group. At VMware, we call them pods because we have our own name for them, which stands for Power of Difference. So if you're Googling for anything about the disability pod that I run, make sure you use the word pod, all uppercase, because it's an acronym. What they are about is they are about people who identify it with as particular underrepresented groups. So VMware has 27 pods. The disability pod is just one of them. And how they make the issues that impact their group known to the general population. So it's made up, our membership is made up of both people who identify as disabled, but also allies of people with disability. You always need to explicitly include allies, because if you don't, you're going to miss all the people with hidden disabilities who don't want to be public about their discussion. But when you say our group is also open to allies, and somebody comes and they don't have a visible disability, nobody looks at them and goes, oh, does that person have a disability? Because they realize that the audience is open to allies as well.
More great points. Rocio is asking, how are champions chosen?
I don't know how they do it at OLG. At VMware, champions volunteer. So we don't pick people. People come to us. We might suggest to somebody, especially if they're new and maybe don't know about the champions program, that the champions program exists. But it's a self-designated choice. And we give people badges and, swag when they complete the different levels of the program.
At OLG, this is actually a compliance department initiative. So all the people from the regulatory leads are actually part of the compliance department. I can speak from other networks I've been in. I know the BBC recently stood up a champions network, and theirs was on a voluntary base only. So they put out a open call, and I'm assuming that most would be similar to what you would do in an organization. You'd have an open call, and it's also similar to an accessibility advisory committee, which we've had in the past at other organizations. So you put out a call and say, you'd like to have people who are sympathetic to achieving certain goals, and kind of go from there.
Thanks.
Speaking as somebody who did accessibility and compliance once, that's not my favorite place for it. People typically don't like compliance because they think of the whole compliance and auditing process as negative. The Champions program that I'm associated with because it's connected. So the Champions program is run entirely by the accessibility team, and then the pods, the employee resource group, is owned by DEI.
So it's interesting you say that, because we are actually inside of the compliance division within OLG, but I happen to agree with you. So I don't like when I speak about accessibility, I feel like that abstracts the user from the discussion. So I very much like to talk about user experience and try to remove the whole notion of compliance from the conversation. So I definitely agree with you.
Accessibility itself is actually owned by design at VMware. and it belongs to the division that provides engineering services across the entire organization. Because as I mentioned, the siloed business unit structure makes it difficult to cut across all of them. We couldn't belong to any one silo, because then that would dilute our ability to impact the other silos.
Got it. Now, VPADs, you mentioned earlier, Valerie Honeysuckle has a question. What is the best way to get access to a company's VPAD? So could you also explain what is a VPAD and how useful it is?
Sure. So VPAD stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It's actually part of a larger report that's called an Accessibility Conformance Report. And this is, again, a US thing. It used to be that companies just put their VPADs publicly out on their websites. And then they started to get used in litigation. And so legal departments saw that as a risk and started to take VPADs down. And so now, I would say probably only about maybe a third of organizations publish their VPADs publicly, where anybody in the world can access them without any tracking. And probably closer to half to 2/3 require you to call their customer support department or go through sales, or somehow make contact with the organization so they know who you are before they give you the information. So there are 4 different formats. Trying to put up 4 fingers. Sorry, there we go. 4 for the VPADs. There's the 508 version of it, which just has disclosures that pertain to 508. There's the WCAG version, which just has WCAG disclosures. There's the international version, and then there's an EU specific version as well, because the EU does sort of recognize VPADs as a form of accessibility disclosure. Some organizations in the EU will ask you for more information above and beyond what you have in your VPAD.
They have more rigorous ICT standards, I think.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that to recognize as the product owner, it's only a snapshot in time, right? It only explains for a product what you have done for that very specific version of that product with the very specific testing that you did. So if you are a consumer asking for a VPAD, that's a starting point, but you also need to have a good understanding of what is it that this organization is doing to maintain this accessibility going forward, because anybody who's been in accessibility for more than about 3 days understands that accessibility is a program. It is not a project, and you're continuously identifying things that you could have done better and going back and fixing them, and identifying things that you could have done better and going back and fixing them. So understanding what that process is within an organization gives you a higher level of confidence that they're going to be able to maintain that level of accessibility going forward.
Thank you. Chris, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, and especially in the procurement side of things, if you're looking for products and services, if you can find vendors that are willing to take your guidance and put it into their SDLC as an example, that's a valuable partner to have. And maybe their tool is not where it is at the moment, where it needs to be at the moment, but if they have an actual willingness to work with you, I think that puts you in a really good position. And that's something that I would give more credence to.
Absolutely. And I would say on the flip side, if the answer is what's a VPAD, you got issues, because accessibility never happens by accident. Accessibility only happens when intention and good people get involved.
Absolutely. How about training? Do you do a lot of internal accessibility training? How do you tailor the audience to make sure, like, is there a role-based? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So we've got 6 different roles that we have set. Some of our modules apply to all roles. Some are very specific to only 1 or sometimes 2 roles. We like to do as many assistive technology demonstrations as we can. So we participate in a lot of internal VMware conferences to try to get the developers who are actually writing the code to get more exposure to how it is that people with disabilities access things. And more importantly, how they think about consuming data. Because once you understand how people with disabilities consume data, the accessibility guidelines become obvious. I would much rather them understand the why and the how, and I'm less concerned about the what, because you will get to the what if they understand the why and the how.
So is that demonstration based, Sherry, or do you have them partake in hands-on exercises? How do you roll that out?
I'm very against empathy labs. We do not have one rolled out. I hope we don't roll one out. You know, spending a day in a wheelchair does not teach you what my life in a wheelchair is like. And I think that's true for any of the disabilities. So we do demos largely. You know, hands-on training programs. We're starting to shift to a more video-based approach. You know, again, pandemic, right? You know, your time is more blocked up in meetings. I don't know anybody who's been able to take an entire day off for training or an entire day off for a conference. It's just not nearly as feasible now as it used to be. But you do have meetings where an hour has been blocked and the meeting only took 40 minutes. So if you've got a whole bunch of little 15-minute training modules lined up, then they can just say, hey, I've got 15 minutes left. I'm going to go consume the next module. And if you make it easy for them, they will do that. And you also have to make it interesting because accessibility, when you don't have the passion and commitment to it that necessarily the three of us do, it's hard to keep it interesting. And so you definitely need to pay attention to that so that people don't look at it as, oh, you know, drudgery, because that's not what you want people to think about when they think about accessibility training.
Yeah. Anything you wanted to add, Chris?
For us, we kind of attack it as needed. So when we identify issues with teams, we'll liaise with them, and then we'll try to create one-on-one training to work with them to massage those needs and raise those competencies. But to Sherry's point, one of the things we've realized is, you know, scalability is a real challenge. So leveraging things like video is a necessity now, really, to kind of get that return on investment for the time that you put in, because you can't continually have the same live session over and over and over again. So the goal kind of for us is to create a bunch of modules, put it into our LMS system so we can track who's watching it. And then, you know, we can encourage people to do it. Sometimes certain things, like from an AODA standpoint, there's mandatory training that must happen, you know, so people can do that. And then, so just roll out a program that way. And then as needed, we can do hands-on training where there's, you know, a real good need for it.
And at a previous role, just to continue on with a thought that you just expressed, Chris, we actually did retrospectives on every production accessibility bug and traced back which developer was responsible for that. And at the time, the development had been completely outsourced to another company. And if somebody made more than 2 accessibility mistakes in a quarter, they got flagged to go through the training again.
Interesting.
Oh, that's smart. That's very, very interesting. Now, the reason that I really came up with this whole accessibility in the enterprise idea is, well, one was to just share with each other different activities and different actions that we've taken in order to improve the accessibility, because it's such a tough job. But the other is, if you're starting from scratch and you're tasked with creating an accessibility department inside of an enterprise, where do you go? What does day one look like? So I'd really love you to think about this and share, you know, to your advice to somebody that's starting day one. What should they think about? What should they watch out for? Or just any general thoughts, rather than me giving you a more specific question than that, just in a general way, what comes to mind?
So I've done day one several times, and my common approach to day one now is starting by creating an accessibility inventory, because I've never gone to work for a large organization where they had a good handle on what it is that they were actually facing in terms of what had to be accessible and how bad was it. So getting to draw a line around the universe of I now know what I don't know, I think is critical, because you're going to go ask for funding. And if you go ask for funding based on what you're told on day one, guess what? You're going to underestimate your funding needs probably by somewhere between 50 and 90%, and then have to go back and ask for more money. And you don't want to have to do that. So I think taking the time to do that is really critical. I would say, in terms of pointing to a single thing that's been the most valuable thing we've done across our enterprise, is we're starting to integrate our automated accessibility tests into our continuous integration pipelines. Remember the whole shift left thing, right? Or shift left, I guess, that way on the camera. Anyways, the point is that if somebody goes to check a container of code in and a new test fails that was previously passing, don't let the code be checked in. Reject the check-in and say, hey, go fix this bug or go fix these bugs, and then check it in. And that's how you can prevent accessibility regressions. And that's something that scales very well in a large organization.
Absolutely. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of touch on what Sherry said, I mean, from my perspective, if you're walking into a new organization, you have to know, you have to learn the landscape. You have to learn what you're dealing with in the first place. You have to learn the players. You have to see where are you strong, where are you weak, and then you have to build. And once again, I talk of it as a business case, but you really need to understand where you stand before you can really formulate your plan. So that's kind of what I had to do when I started OLG. They had their own department. However, you're coming in, you have to learn a whole new industry, and it can be quite a challenge. So it's really critical to understand, who especially who are sympathetic. Like, establishing your own network of people who you can lean on when you have issues, and that you're going to have an easier time pushing your mandate forward. That's also critical as well.
Yeah, and also just to clarify for the third time, because I don't think I did it that well the first couple, regarding the business case, like, I do think they're super important to deliver them. I just meant that often you would see it done in kind of a weird way. And it is really important to get it right, particularly on the enterprise, because it's all about the profit at the end of the day, right? So It's about how do you turn what is an obvious need into metrics, and in a way you can't do that because you really need the whole culture to have accessibility to be a part of it, because how are you going to really quantify when there's so many different kinds of disabilities? It's really about getting awareness of the entire culture of how you're building that product out. So Sherry said you're solving, or I think you did, Chris, as well, you're solving that in the earlier stages, so you don't have that 10x problem as an accessibility bug is being discovered. Now I'm going to go to some questions and then ask you for the final thoughts. So I'm just reading this out. Carolyn Chesler said, "Hi Chris, today I will be examining a roundtable of interactive accessibility courses for QES, SDETS, and DEVS in Mo FinTech organization. These will be required courses. I've discovered many guides, but not many courses. We're looking to have all engineering staff trained per their role, and beginner level is desired. It looks like I may need to create the curriculum myself." I don't know if there was a question in there, but and I didn't understand all the terms because it looks like fintech, but any comment there, Chris?
QE is quality engineering. So that's the people who are actually running the tests. A lot of times.
Here's the question. Do you know any courses? In the chat.
So I frequently recommend the DQ courses, because the DQ courses were developed around being able at the end of the DQ courses to take the IAAP certification exams. And I think that they're cost effective for that approach. There are other organizations, their price point won't suit. Then I would look at, is it open access? What, do you remember the name of that?
WebAIM.
There's some free courses out there. I'm spacing on the name, but
Teach
it's
Alley?
never gonna. I'm sorry, what?
Is it Teach Alley?
Thank you, that one.
Yeah.
Teach Ally has free available, because if you can't afford DQ, you definitely can't afford the licensing, the comprehensive courses from Level Access, because those are even much more expensive than DQ. You're never going to get something that works for your environment. All you're going to get is generic accessibility, and it's critical that you take that material and customize it for your environment,
100%.
because otherwise, at the end of the course, the person isn't going to know, okay, how do I apply this to my job, right? Because they're not going to understand how it links to your design system, how it links to your build system, how it links to your anything else that you do internally.
Thanks.
I agree with that.
All right. I'm going to sneak in one more question and then go to final thoughts. David says, I recently learned about AXCore automated accessibility tester found on ThoughtWorks Tech Radar. Are you familiar with this one? Is there other build time accessibility checkers readily available?
So Wave has an API, which is relatively inexpensive to license. It ranges from free for a lot of situations. All you can eat global, as many hits as many API calls as you want for a year is $12,000, which for a company like VMware is nothing. So we use Wave internally, and then the reason how Crest got its name, what do waves do when they're done? They crest. So that's where that name came from. So we have them run together, and Crest uses the same JSON reporting structure as Wave does, so you can run it as one batch of tests and get one set of integrated results.
Thank you, Sherry. All right.
But then there's also Lighthouse. I mean, there's other things that you can do. They all kind of sort of do the same thing. They just do it a little bit differently. I'm a big fan, as an assistive technology user, of working with live data, because it's all about how does the assistive technology play with the user experience. And if all you're doing is sniffing code, you don't get that.
Another good point. All right, this has been great, but believe it or not, we're at 11:29, so I'm going to ask you for some brief final thoughts and wrap up. So, Chris, I'd like you to go first.
I mean, I guess my final thoughts is I'm just a big fan of the community that we get to work in. I'm appreciative of people like you, Joe, who are bringing together people and putting out a lot of great content and whatnot. So I just kind of wanted to thank you and your team for that.
Thank you, Chris. And Sherry, we're going to give you the last word.
Sure. Eat the elephant one spoonful at a time. Accessibility can seem large and overwhelming when you have an organization that already has established practices that accessibility hasn't been part of. You got to start somewhere. Not starting is not an option.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. This has been so informative. I really appreciate you joining us. And as I wrap up and hand it back to Natasha, I will also add that our third annual State of Accessibility report will be going out on December 8th, and we will have a webinar to announce the results. We will send everybody who is registered for this webinar a link to sign up. And we did expand our testing, and we will release never before seen data. So I'm really excited for releasing that. Please do watch out for that.
I am too. I'll definitely be there.
Oh,
Thanks,
I know you will. You're one of those that consistently give great feedback. So I appreciate that, Sherry. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I will hand it back to Natasha to have the final thoughts here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists. We will also be sending a recording of this webinar so you can share it with colleagues that weren't unable to attend. And again, have a wonderful day, and thanks from Diamond.